This is my sectoral balance talk called Fun with Emojis. Fun not guaranteed. There will be emojis though. So we have a man and a woman. Actually, I don't like that because they look too similar. Yeah, that's better. Actually, I don't like him because he has too much hair. I don't think that's particularly relatable. Yeah, that's better. And perfect. So we've got a man and a woman, and the man has an apple and the woman has none. I don't know why the woman has no apple. Don't overthink it. It's not important for the moment. But the man gives his apple to the woman. I don't know why he gives the apple to the woman. Maybe he is in love with her. Or maybe she points a gun at his head. It doesn't matter. The point is that now she has an apple and now he has none. So he has less than he started with and she has more than she started with. In other words, he's in deficit and she's in surplus. Now let's try that again with cash, and in this scenario he's going to give her $150 or buy $150 worth of stuff, and she's going to give $100 back to him or buy $100 worth of stuff too. Now obviously he's in deficit and she's in surplus. He's going to be $50 worse off than she is. But that's just monetarily. We do not know who is better off overall. Maybe the stuff he bought was really cool, or maybe she's just better at making deals than he is. I don't know who you'd rather be. Maybe you'd prefer to be the guy because he has that really cool moustache. Looks good. Now if we switch the people out for the government and the private sector, don't get confused here, the private sector includes all households and all businesses, just using a house because that's where we all live. Now if the government spends $100 into the economy and then taxes out $90 at the end of the year, they're going to be in deficit by $10. Ooh, that's bad for a government to be in. But if look on the other side, we'll see that the private sector has a $10 surplus. That's good because remember, that's where we all live. Now, if we do the same scenario but switch it around so that when the government spends $100, they tax back $110, that's more than they put in. Well, this is great because now the government has a $10 surplus. But if you look at the private sector, what do we have? We have a $10 deficit. And that's bad because now the private sector has to dip into their savings or find that $10 to pay their taxes elsewhere. Now, if we move the surplus sign up there and the deficit sign down there, and we take that last year where the government was in surplus and the private sector was in deficit, and then we do another year where it's the reverse, we will see even when the government is in a bigger deficit or in a much bigger surplus, there's always this sort of mirror effect that's going on. Whatever is happening on the top is happening on the bottom and vice versa. Someone's surplus is always someone's deficit. You might be wondering what happens if the government spends $100 and then taxes back that same $100 at the end of the year. Well, we could say that the government is in balance and so is the private sector, in which case no one is happy, and if we went back to our graph we wouldn't see any emojis, but we're not going to do this because that's pretty unusual in a complex society. It would never really happen. So instead we're going to do something a bit more interesting. I'm going to bring in a new character here. You see those planes there? That is now representing the foreign sector. I could have done boats, but I like the planes. I don't know, you do boats. So if I fill in the graph a little bit more, we can see that even though we now have three sectors in play, we've still got that mirror effect, top and bottom. Even when they switch around, they have to be exactly the same. That's just the way the accounting works. And we're starting to form a fishbone-like graph here. It's also known as the sectoral balances. Now that we have all our sectors in play, I'm going to switch out the government sector for the red emoji here, and I'm going to make the private sector blue and the foreign sector green, and I'm going to do that so I can show you this graph. This is Australia's sectoral balances over the last 30 years or so. You can see there on the right-hand side, those were the COVID years. A lot more government spending occurred there. But look what's happening on the top of the graph. There's all this net saving in the private sector. If you cast your eye over to the middle of the graph, you can see those little surpluses there peeking out. They are John Howard's years. He's very proud of those surpluses. But what is happening at the bottom end of the graph? You can see an explosion in private sector deficits. That also coincides with a massive increase in household debt. And that's a situation that pretty much continues up until the 2008 GFC. The same situation occurred here, the United States and around the world, where all that financial fragility caused by increasing private sector deficits may have caused that financial crash. You might notice as well that sea of green over the top. That is because for the most of this period, the foreign sector was in surplus. That means more profits are going from Australia to the foreign sector. It pretty much finishes in the COVID era, essentially because China has a high demand for Australian resources. Now I'm going to show you one more graph here. This is the UK's sectoral balances going back 244 odd years. It's great that they have all this data so that we can do this analysis. And what you're going to notice here is that spike, that is World War I. The one next to it is World War II. And all the way down on the left-hand side, those are the wartime spending for the Napoleonic Wars. That's fun, isn't it? Have a croissant. You might also notice if we zoom in here that government sector deficit is associated with the Boer War, which is something to do with pigs, I imagine. But if we zoom out and we acknowledge that, yes, governments will spend higher in a crisis, if we look to the right of the graph, you'll notice that the government is mostly in deficit because deficit spending in a country like the UK, Australia and the United States is actually the normal state of affairs. If you look at the center of the graph, there is a bit of an anomaly there. That is all that green, and that is associated with the period of British Empire. It turns out if you're going to take over a bunch of countries, it's pretty good because you end up with a bunch of customers to sell all your stuff to. So that's good. When we think about government spending, we consider their policies, and that might be spending on things like the healthcare sector, the education sector, or maybe nuclear-powered submarines. There are no submarine emojis, so this is going to have to do. When the government is interested in finding out the effects of these policies, they might take them to Treasury, where Treasury is full of very smart people and they will want to determine the effect of a given policy on the budget. But as we've seen from history, budgets do go up and down. And the question is whether the budget is the most important factor in determining whether a policy is good or bad. When Treasury wants to determine the effect on the budget, they're going to assume certain things, and they include full employment, inflation to target, and GDP at potential. Now, these are all things that economists generally agree are good things to strive for, so it's a bit unusual then that we assume those things have already happened in order to determine the effect on the budget. So why don't we swap those out and put them in there as the goals for a given policy? That is, does a policy affect the level of employment, whether inflation stays at target, and maybe GDP is a little bit problematic, so we might switch that out for the effect on the environment. Returning to our Emoji Sectoral Balances, we might consider that it makes sense for the government to generally be in deficit. This makes sense both historically and economically because the private sector likes to net save. And just for the sake of argument, we're going to make the foreign sector in balance. And now if we're to understand that a government's spending is its real-world policies, we might see that when the government invests in the healthcare sector, that means in private households we're going to have more doctors and nurses. And when the government invests in the education sector, that means in households we're going to have more teaching staff. And if the government chooses to invest in nuclear-powered submarines, well, that means we're going to have John, Paul, George, and Ringo. But if you don't like the Beatles and you would prefer that we have environmental policies, well, maybe that means we're going to have clean land, clean water, clean air, and clean kangaroos, apparently. So now that we're focusing on balancing our economy rather than our budget, perhaps we can understand that deficits and surpluses don't quite matter as much as we once thought they did. Okay, folks, that was my Emoji Sectoral Balance talk. If you really like this, I'd love it if you'd like, subscribe, maybe share it if you think some other people will get a kick out of this way of explaining this concept. This came out of me trying to describe sectoral balances to someone via text. So if you look down in the description, there'll be a way to find that if you want to annoy your friends with that kind of thing. I might be doing another video soon that goes deeper into the accounting that makes up some of this thinking. That's going to be over here somewhere, or some of my older non-economics videos. Subscribe for more. That's it.